Hello and welcome to On the House, our podcast on all things housing. Eric and I decided to talk about domestic migration and how it may impact the housing market in the US. And to clarify, by domestic migration, we mean when folks move inside the country. They could be moving in the same neighborhood. They could be moving from one city to the next in the same state. They could be moving from one county to another, or they could be moving from one state to another, like folks move from California to Arizona or Texas, or folks moving from New York to Florida. So in this podcast, we are going to talk about domestic migration, specifically migration across state boundaries, and how it has impacted the housing markets in these states. My name is Reena Agrawal, Senior Research Economist here at Veros Real Estate Solutions.
And my name is Eric Fox. I'm Chief Economist here at Veros Real Estate Solutions. And I might add, we're here in our beautiful new studio in Orange County, California today. And I have to say it's a definite upgrade from where we've been doing RiskWire in previous months. So it's a very nice environment to have our first podcast from the new studios. So we see a lot of information on the news about people moving. There's states that are losing population. There are states that are gaining population. And we thought it'd be fun to take a look at how does that impact the housing market. Reena's already made some comments about different states. I think we've seen states like California, states like Illinois and New York losing or being a net out-migration states, whereas states like Texas or North Carolina or Florida being net in-migration states. So we thought we would start to look at that and see, number one, is there any differences in house price changes in these markets? And is that the full story when we look at the raw migration numbers? So what kind of data exists on this for a few of the states, Reena?
I think a lot of us heard about a lot of this migration, especially following the start of the pandemic in 2020, 21, 22, when we heard thousands of people were moving from states like, as you mentioned, California, New York, Illinois, to the Sun Belt, to Arizona, to Texas, to Florida, and to the Carolinas. And specifically, from July 2020 to July 2021, nearly 250,000 people moved to Florida and 200,000 people moved to Texas, whereas from California, 480,000 people moved out of the state. And if you look at data from July 21 to July 22, nearly 314,000 people moved to Florida, 222,000 moved to Texas, and nearly 337,000 people left California. So in all, around over those 2 years, 800,000 people left California, more than 500,000 people moved to Florida, and around 420,000 people moved to Texas.
So it's definitely consistent. It wasn't just like a one-time aberration in one small period. It was year after year.
Yes. And so what do we think happened to prices, their home prices? In Florida, as you can see, prices increased by 53% over those 2 years. That is from July 2020 to July 2022. In Texas, prices increased by 39%. And in California, you would think that prices may have decreased, but actually they increased by 33%. So the obvious question is, if people are leaving California in droves, 800,000 people left California over 2 years, why did prices rise in California?
Well, yeah, that's very counterintuitive, actually. And if we take a step back and we look at economic theory, When people move into a region like a Texas or a Florida, demand for the housing rises, prices and rents tend to increase, and construction activity would then pick up to help accommodate that demand. On the other hand, when people leave, demand is going to fall. Housing supply may exceed demand, and prices then may soften. So that's really simple textbook economics 101, supply and demand. So right off the bat here, something seems maybe like it's not quite standard classic textbook.
So actually, there is standard classical demand and supply happening, but we are not looking at the entire picture. So we're talking about domestic migration, but that is not all that is contributing to a population change in a state. Population is changing also because there is net international migration happening to a state, and also there is natural population increase or decrease that is happening due to the births and deaths in a particular state. So what happened in California, even though 800,000 people were leaving, there was significant international net migration happening to California. Also, there was a natural increase in population, which means that population was kind of stable. We did not really lose people on the total, and there was just like a few thousand net gains or losses. So that means that there was no really downward pressure on housing.
That definitely makes sense then. Well, I know for some more recent data, if we dive into some other states from July 2024 to July 2025, if we now kind of look through all the different sources of migration data. So one of the states I think we mentioned early on was North Carolina as being a net in-migration state. So, for example, there were 84,000 people during that time frame that came into North Carolina for domestic migration. International was 47,000, and there was a 15,000 natural growth. So that's simply births minus deaths. And so during that time, with that increase, home prices went up almost 3%. So if I look at that, that sort of makes sense. But now suppose I look at Texas. During that same time frame, 67,000 people came into the state from domestic migration from other states, 167,000 from international, and births minus deaths were 158,000 for the natural growth. So a very large influx. So what happened to house prices? They were by and large flat. So that doesn't make sense, Reena.
Yes, and a similar pattern was seen in Arizona, where 31,000 people moved in domestically. Another 28,000 came from international sources, and natural growth was 8,000, but prices remained flat or they were slightly declining. But we saw in South Carolina that there was more domestic migration, there was international migration. Prices rose by 3.6%. And in Florida, in contrast, there was a total increase of 197,000 people from domestic migration, from international migration. There was a slight decrease, though, in natural growth, and home prices actually declined by about 1%. So that is not what we expect to be happening. So clearly there are more factors playing into the housing market besides just population growth or declines.
So it seems like whatever case I want to prove, you've given me the data to prove my point, but then there's always a counterexample to disprove my point. So what are some of these other things, or how can we investigate what's really going on?
I mean, let's also look at the flip side. I mean, here also we see differing patterns. For example, we have talked about California. And if we look at data for California from July 2024 to July 2025. Domestic migration was a net loss of 229,000 people. International migration was a net gain of 109,000 people, and natural growth was another 109,000 people. So California actually lost only 9,000 people in 2024 to 2025. And home price growth was almost flat, which kind of seems to, align with the supply and demand theory.
Okay.
But then when you look at New York and Illinois, in New York, the net gain in population in that same time period was just 1,000.
So essentially zero.
So you would think home prices would be zero, but home prices actually increased by 7.7%. And if you look at Illinois, there was a net gain of only 16,000 people, but home prices increased by 7%. So we are seeing again differences between California and places like New York and Illinois, where for the similar growth in population, California, it was almost flat, but New York and Illinois are showing 7% growth in home prices. So even beyond the net population gains or losses, something else is playing into the picture, right?
It seems like that's the case. So now we have even more examples to illustrate that point. So let's take a look at what actually is driving housing demand. Clearly, migration has an effect, no doubt about that. And there's lots of markets where you can see very specific results of house price changes as a result of in-migration or out-migration. So we're not saying this has no effect. We're just saying it's not the only effect. So let's take a look at a state like California. California has very strict zoning laws. So there are supply constraints. So there's limited land availability, especially in the coastal markets. There is very slow construction due to regulations. So supply is extremely tight. And even if we see demand weaken a little bit, prices don't fall drastically. Other thing that we have to stop and ask ourselves is when folks leave a state due to, say, domestic migration, are all of the people that are migrating going to impact the housing market in the same way? And a lot of folks who say leave California and let's say move to Texas, they're doing so perhaps because they can't afford to live in California. They want to buy a house in a less expensive market like Texas. So they weren't causing demand in California to go up or down if they stayed or left. And as a result, when they leave, they're leaving behind the high-income households who are going to continue to compete for those limited supply of housings, and that's going to keep the market in a very strong position. So even though we see 200,000 or 300,000 leaving the state, they weren't going to be purchasing homes in the state of California. So I guess we have to say that there's differences in the folks that are migrating in terms of demand and supply for housing.
I think another factor that plays into the whole picture is new construction. We saw, especially during the time of the pandemic, when folks were moving in droves to Texas or to Florida or to the Carolinas, new construction followed suit very soon after. There were so many new projects that were under construction. Developers took that opportunity, because they were seeing a lot of housing demand. So suddenly there was a lot of new construction in these places. What happened with all this new construction is it put a downward pressure on the existing home supply. So that is why, new construction did not happen immediately in 2020 to 2022, but it followed. It happened in 23, in 24. So suddenly now we see a lot of new construction there. And that construction, that new supply has overwhelmed the demand there. So that is why we're kind of seeing like a flat price growth or even slightly declining as we saw in Florida. So new construction matters. There has not been significant new construction in a state like California, and in places like New York and Illinois, new construction has been very negligible.
Do we have any data on that, Reena?
So yes, fortunately I found this great data, and I found that if you look at new construction data for 1 to 4 units, that is single family, detached, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, we find that in a state like North Carolina, new construction average share of sales was 26% in 24 to 25. That is, 1 in 4 houses was a new construction sale. In South Carolina, actually this percentage was 31%.
Wow.
In Florida, it was 25%. In Texas, the share of new construction was 28%. But when you see in a state like California, share of new construction was only 14%.
Oh, wow.
And if you go to New York, it was less than 4%. It was around 6% in Illinois. So you see how new construction is impacting supply in different states, and how that then impacts pricing differently in different states.
So migration does have an impact, but then because of the new construction, that allows that state to either absorb that migration very readily,
Yes,
or not, in the case of, say, Texas or Florida.
yes. So when we're talking about migration, I think when we hear that folks are moving out of California, folks are moving out of New York, and people are moving to Florida, and people are moving to Texas, but that is just not the entire story. We have to look at international migration, we have to look at natural population growth, and then we also have to see supply. How is new supply coming up? How much of that is coming up? And also then we have to look at demographics. We have to see who is moving. If young folks are moving, people who have just got jobs, maybe they just go and rent a place in Texas or Florida. So we might see increases in rents, but not so much as home prices, because they're not looking to buy a home. But if families are moving, then they might want to buy a house, and then that might exert pressure on house prices. So we have to see really who is moving, whether they are going to increase demand for housing, whether they are going to increase demand for rental properties. So all that plays a big picture, all that adds up into the total demand. And then we have to look at the total supply, whether it's the existing supply is being supplemented by new supply. So once you look at all those factors, I think we can come up with why prices are rising or stable or falling in different states.
Yeah, this is every month we have a product that's called Vero Forecast, and the models in Vero Forecast are actually quite complex, and population changes are one variable that impacts house price changes. There's unemployment rate and interest rate and supply of homes, etc. So it's actually a very complex, multivariate problem to accurately gauge demand and how house prices are going to change. And so sometimes the headlines where out-migration is this or in-migration is this, there's a single variable causality to changes in house prices. It often turns out in the real world, it's not quite that simple.
I agree. So what do you think we can expect going forward? How will domestic migration play out? What will happen to population changes? I think one thing we have seen is that international migration has reduced significantly over the last year. Also, we are observing in many parts of the country that natural population growth has shrunk a lot. In fact, there are many counties where it's negative right now. So I think going forward, domestic migration will play a huge role in determining where population is increasing or decreasing. But that domestic migration has also slowed down compared to what we saw in the early years of the pandemic.
Yes, that is true. I'm noticing those numbers down quite a lot. But I think relative to international and natural births minus deaths, it stands to reason that that is going to begin to have a larger influence. It remains to be seen whether international migration is going to continue on its downward trajectory or if it's leveling out. But I think in a previous podcast, we actually talked quite a bit about the decline in birth rates. I mean, they are significantly lower than they were back in the 70s, and I don't think there's any sense of those dramatically increasing.
Yes.
And with the aging of the baby boomers, the deaths will certainly continue to go up. So I don't think we're going to get a lot of natural population growth in the coming decade or so. So that is going to make it difficult for that to come and support. So I think it stands to reason that domestic migration is going to have a much larger influence maybe than it does today. So perhaps if we were having this conversation 10 years from now, we would be saying that the domestic migration numbers do align a little bit more closely with house price changes.
So we are seeing a lot of different patterns evolving as we are moving. And for example, one other pattern we are observing is that what we saw during the pandemic, a lot of folks were moving out from these denser urban areas to more sparsely populated areas. But now we are seeing that fewer households are actually leaving cities for suburbs. And that shift that we were observing, that, population growth is happening in smaller towns, I think that has kind of slowed down also. So there were high growth markets earlier during the pandemic, like we saw Arizona and Texas. I think those have also slowed down quite a bit. So I think we have to see how those patterns evolve over time, how that will impact housing. Right now, we are not seeing any major significant flows either out or either into a particular state. Okay.
Well, this has been a very interesting, perhaps counterintuitive discussion today. I learned a lot, actually, as we broke down the numbers.
Yes.
So thank you, Reena, for your research on this. Reena put together a lot of the research for our podcast here today. We hope you enjoyed it. Again, my name is Eric Fox.
And I'm Reena Agrawal. Hope to see you next time.